I now look to Wayne David MP to continue the case for the opposition.
Thank you, Mr. President, for the invitation to come along here this evening. I grew up as a young man under Margaret Thatcher. I remember her well, but I have to say that I remember extremely well that famous spitting image scene of hers. You recall? She was there with members of her cabinet, and the waiter turned to her first of all and said, "Beef?" He said, "Yes, I'll have beef." "Vegetables?" "No, they'll answer for themselves." And I think that basically, but it was very interesting how Margaret Thatcher was the dominant person in politics at the time. And it's true to say that it's her personality which dominated all else. But my contention is it wasn't just her personality, it is her ideology as well. And her ideology stood for her exacerbating conflict, creating dislocation, and creating hardship in the country, because the end justified the means. She wanted to create a more equal society. She wanted to create a more divided society because she believed that somehow, but mystically, create a better Britain. Well, it didn't. I grew up under Margaret Thatcher. I grew up in a mining community. I saw the miners' strike at first hand. I remember members of the gay community coming down from London and elsewhere to give solidarity to the miners. And I knew at first hand what the strike was all about, protecting jobs and protecting communities. This wasn't about Arthur Scargill, this was about Margaret Thatcher. Let her be the centre of this debate, not Arthur Scargill. And I remember too, but those men went on strike out of desperation. They didn't want to go on strike, but they felt they had no alternative. And what happened when they lost that strike? They were proved right, because Margaret Thatcher immediately closed colliery after colliery after colliery after colliery. In the constituency which I represent today, they closed Bedworth Colliery, the largest colliery in the area, immediately, within weeks of the end of the miners' strike. A few months later, they closed Penallta, again in my constituency, the largest colliery in the South Wales goldfield. And it wasn't just, but collieries were closed willy-nilly. There was no serious attempt made to provide alternative training or alternative employment. Those communities and those individuals were simply left to rot. That's why we saw an increase in the levels of unemployment under Margaret Thatcher, as a deliberate act of government. And what is more, we didn't just see unemployment rise. We saw thousands and thousands and thousands of men being put on incapacity benefit, being made to claim sickness benefit. And that is still a legacy which inflicts many former coalfield communities today. But it didn't just begin and end with the mining communities, because what we saw in the mining communities was replicated elsewhere in other industrial heartlands. We saw a massive deindustrialization taking place. We saw 3 million people being made deliberately unemployed. And I also think it's important to remember that the ideology which Margaret Thatcher had was honed by Sir Keith Joseph, was brought in from abroad, from America. It brought in by the Chicago School, and it was a deliberate intention right from the start to claw back power from the state to make sure that there's a reduction consistently in the levels of public expenditure. And what did that result in? It resulted in pensioner poverty being increased from 13% of the population to 43% of the population. It's difficult to imagine today just how difficult it was for senior citizens under Margaret Thatcher, but they were at the sharp edge. Child poverty under Margaret Thatcher doubled. Let's not forget that. There were children going hungry in this country because deliberately of Margaret Thatcher's policy. We saw an increase in crime under Margaret Thatcher. And above all else, let's not forget, we saw a huge increase in inequality under Margaret Thatcher. Yes, we saw some people get richer, but it was the top 10% who were laughing all the way to the banks whilst millions of people in this country experienced poverty and destitution for the first time in their lives. We've heard a lot about housing and the great achievement, but let's not forget this. When council houses were sold, the local authorities who had the money were not allowed to build new council houses. And you want to know why there's a problem with housing today? Just look back into Margaret Thatcher's time, and she deliberately, ideologically opposed the construction of new council houses. No, I won't take time because we haven't moved on. But I want to say this too. Nothing epitomizes Margaret Thatcher better than anything else than the poll tax. The poll tax was a financial and fiscal disaster. But it is something which was intrinsically unfair because it is not based on the ability to pay. I'll give you one example. The Duke of Westminster was paying before the poll tax £10,225 a year in rates. With the poll tax, he was paying £417. He was paying exactly the same as his housekeeper and his resident chauffeur. Where is the fairness in that? Margaret Thatcher knew what she was doing. It is quite deliberate. It is to create a more unequal society, with the rich getting richer and the poor always getting poorer. But let's not forget too, that if Margaret Thatcher was renowned for anything, it is the phrase that there is no such thing as society. There is no such thing as society, she said, only the individuals and families. That is profoundly wrong. We are all living in a society, and we should be proud of our society. Human beings are not individuals living in splendid isolation. Human beings are people who work together in their communities and their families and in their society. And that's why I say it's very, very important for us to recognize that Margaret Thatcher wasn't a hero of the working class. Margaret Thatcher was an enigma, yes, but something which was profoundly wrong in my view, and something which we should make sure never ever comes back in a different form. Margaret Thatcher was no hero for the working class, but we all need to learn the harsh lessons of her 11 years in government. Thank you.